We're getting near the end of the videos, just this one and one more to go. In this video, we're going to look at miscellaneous administrative issues, everything from binders to checklists to vests to phones to forms. Please try to become familiar with the binders that are found both at the intake center and the shelter. Both of them have policies and procedures manual, a binder for intake and shelter logs, and then at the intake center also a binder for guest lists, past guest lists in case you need those. The two policies and procedures manuals have front pockets in the front of them, of course, that are updated regularly. These include at both the current night's nightly volunteer roster, at the shelter, the facility and food information, and at intake, the guest exclusion list. The binders also have the position checklists, policies and procedures, and then in the back, contact information that might be needed for you. Before I look specifically at checklists, let me do a reminder of what we mean by core and nightly volunteers. The core volunteers are generally more experienced. They have training such as these. The nightly volunteers, though, are not expected to have either training or experience. The goal is that people can volunteer as often or as little as they want without having a barrier of having to go through training first. Instead, the checklist identifies the various tasks that they would be doing, and core volunteers are there to supervise and to serve as a resource. So core volunteers need to know the checklist, not just for their own role, but also for any nightly volunteers who they're going to supervise. Here's an example of a core volunteer checklist. By the end of the season, or probably after a few shifts, you'll be pretty familiar with everything you need to do. But until then, this is a good resource for you just to make sure that you're hitting all the key points of your role. Similarly, here is a nightly volunteer list, and this one includes the general tasks that a nightly volunteer would do, but they would do this with the support of the core volunteer leader for that position. At the beginning of each shift, you should determine which of your nightly volunteers are new to their role. Go over the appropriate checklist with them, answer any questions they have, and then please replace the checklist in the appropriate place in the binder. Using the checklist as a guide, provide guidance to nightly volunteers until they are comfortable with their role. And also use the checklist to remind yourself of what you need to do or what you need to assign to someone else. Safe Space is going to continue to evolve. If a checklist or anything else in the binder is not meeting needs or doesn't really reflect what it is that we're doing, please call this to the attention of any of the shop team members, the shelter operations managers. Don't just write a change on the checklist, since it very likely will not be found, but instead make sure that one of the members of the shop team knows of a problem, and that way we can make the revision as appropriate. If a revision is made to a checklist or to a policy, a revised copy will be mailed to all core volunteers who fill or supervise that role, and then will be placed in the binder. Safe Space vests. As you've probably seen, we have a bunch of bright green, yellow vests, and the purpose is so that we can easily identify volunteers, both for the guest and for other volunteers. So these should be worn at all times when working in the intake center or the shelter. We're going to pre-print name tags for all the core volunteers and any nightly volunteers who are doing a lot of shifts, but any volunteer who doesn't have a pre-printed name tag should make one. There'll be blank cards near the pre-printed name tags. Just take a Sharpie and write the name on it. This is important not just so that other volunteers know who is who, but also the guests should be able to call you by name. Safe Space has 3 phones, one for the intake center, one for the shelter, and then one for the shelter operations manager. The purpose is to provide easy direct communication among the different parts of Safe Space without having to figure out what individual is there and what their phone number is. We have various contact numbers that are pre-programmed in for easy access. And this also gives you easy access to a telephone in case of an emergency without having to find your own telephone. Each of the phones comes with a lanyard. The intake team leader and whoever is currently responsible for the shelter, that depends what shift is on duty, should wear this for easy access. When you come on duty, find the phone in the charger or get it from the person you're replacing. Please check to make sure it's turned on, check to make sure it's charged. And the intake team leader should charge the phone prior to leaving for the night. At the shelter, we hope that the overnight A shift will do the charging, but it can be charged again as needed. Chargers for each of the phone are in a black box in the shelter operations box at each facility. And prior to closing the facility, the phone should be placed back in that box and should be put back in the shelter operations box. The different phones have different pre-programmed numbers. These are also found in the binder as well as the phone itself. But as you can see, we'll have pre-programmed numbers where you can find the numbers you would call regularly, and that includes the emergency and non-emergency police numbers. You can activate any of the speed dial numbers just by pressing the appropriate number and then hitting send. You can also use voice. You can press the clear button that's under OK, and then use voice directions such as call shelter manager. SafeSpace has various forms to use. Some of these are found both at shelter and intake. Others are specific to the location. The daily volunteer roster, as I mentioned, will be placed in the front of each of the binders. This is generated by the volunteer coordinator. Please remember this includes confidential information, so please don't leave it where it will be visible. We're also going to have a supply order form at both locations, but this is still in the works, so we'll do supplies as an update to these. At the intake center, one of the forms is the guest registration form. This is a two-sided form that's on cardstock. It should be completed for all guests the first time that they register at SafeSpace. It includes background information, name, age, etc., but it also includes the agreement to follow SafeSpace rules. The completed forms are filed alphabetically in a file box, and then each night we pull the forms for the persons who are staying at the shelter. Daily log. The purpose is to record which volunteers are on duty, as well as any issues that arise during the shift. All volunteers, both core and nightly, should sign in and sign out. At the end of intake, the intake team leader should describe any problems, any issues that came up, or should just note no problems tonight. Other intake leaders should review recent logs to make sure that they know of any potential concerns that have come up since the last time they were at the intake center. Finally, we have the nightly guest registration. This is the sequential list of guests who are registered each night. It's completed as the guests are entering the property storage area. On it, whoever's filling it out should note females, guests with pets, and couples so that that information can be forwarded to the shelter team. After intake is done, 2 copies will be made of the completed form. One is sent over to the shelter with the guest forms. The other is placed in the binder and becomes the next night's pre-registration list. At the shelter, in the front of the binder, there'll be the venue information form. This is generated every move-in day, and it should be kept in the front of the shelter. It's got the church contacts, anything specific we need to know about the facility, any restrictions we have. Again, you should consult that the first time you're working each week. The shelter also has a daily log, and again, the purpose is to record which volunteers are on duty and any issues that arise. Everyone should be signing in and out. And at the end of each shift, not the end of the day, but the end of each shift, or either of the overnight shifts, the leader should answer the specific questions that are found about the issues that could come up, or again, just note no problem tonight. At the shelter, we're going to have a medication log, but this is to be determined, so we'll let you know once we figure it out. Blank forms will be kept in the shelter administration box at both intake and shelter. The originals for each of the forms will be found in the shelter administration box at intake, and then we can make additional copies using the intake copier as needed. The next video, our last one, is going to discuss guest relations and communications.